To kind of start off, I can't really talk about transaction list without kind of talking about what started it. So I remember about 9 years ago when I started here and I was interviewing with Matthew and Dylan, one of the questions they posed to me in my interview was, if you could make the software do one thing, what would it be? And I, in a panic, blurted out, help customers grab the data that they need to and answer their own questions rather than having to ask us what things mean and how to get the data for them. And about 3 years after that, Dylan created the transaction list. And from that point on, I kind of started working with it, learning how it works and adding to it. And now it's not really my baby, it's still his baby, but I build it out and explain how it works to people and take feature requests and debug anything that's going on there. So to understand why transaction list exists, we kind of need to look at our regular reports first, which if you've been using ITrack for any amount of time, you're probably pretty familiar with them. So this is our standard kind of ITrack report, usually broken up by all the things that you care about: inventory, sales, customers, purchase orders. And if I come over here, you can see that we have to slice that data up a lot of different ways because people want to see their data different ways. Sales by inventory type, sales grouped by customer, sales grouped by tax items. ITrack reports are great in that they, are built by a human being per spec for things that people want, but they have a couple weaknesses. The primary weakness that we always hear about ITrack reports is that it does not cleanly export to Excel. There's a lot of math that goes into some of these fields, basically mini MySQL queries within the report itself, and that stuff doesn't export very cleanly to Excel, which I know is a big need for a lot of people. The second weakness of reports, standard reports, is that they're hard-coded. We have an idea of what we think you want to know. You sometimes tell us what you want to know, and that's built, but when you want changes to it, that comes across to us as a change request, and there's a backlog for those things. So sometimes you just, you like sales by invoice, but maybe there's just one other column you wanted to have on there. Like looking at this right here, for example, it mentions who the counter person is, but it doesn't say who the default salesperson is. So if you were looking at sales by invoice and you're like, hey, iSoft, I'd really like to see salesperson on here, we'll get it done for you, but there's a slight amount of lead time depending on how busy reports are, how complex your request is. And so those changes can take a little while. The transaction list, rather than being a hard-coded thing, is more of a dynamic reporting tool where you guys basically get access to as many of the fields in ITrack's database that we can put in here. You're essentially building a query the way we would build a query in the database backend, but instead of you having to understand the language, we kind of set up things in a way that you would build the query yourself to get at the data you want. So this is the transaction list, and it works best when you approach it with a specific question in mind about a specific thing, trying to get a specific answer out of it. To that end, we start from what we call the sources, which are basically the major screens in ITrack that everybody cares about: work orders, vehicles, sales orders, purchase orders, inventory, and customers. So you come to the transactions, you go, I have some questions about inventory I'd like to get answered. So if you check inventory source, you get two panels here. This panel here is the filter panel. This is basically what's going to qualify the data that you're looking for. And then over here you have fields to display, which is the data that's going to be returned based on the filters you've set up. So a really simple one would be starting with part type. So let's say you have questions about your engine assemblies. And we put a couple of filters in place by default, just so you kind of get a sane first run at filtering. So for example, we always start with a filter of status A, available parts, because we assume you generally want to know about your available inventory before your sold inventory. And we also start out with public parts here, because we assume you're asking questions about parts that are public and for sale. So the way the filters work is when you check a filter, you're telling the transaction list, this filter is now in use. But then you usually have to qualify that in a second way. So you're saying, yes, I'd like to filter by part type. What part type would you like to filter by? Let's filter by engine assembly. You could just filter by nothing, but then there would be no real point in using the part type filter since you're looking for everything. So we're going to go ahead and use engine assembly as an example. And we're going to make sure that we're looking at public engine assemblies that are all status A. But then there's also a couple other things we could look at, like, you know, I'd like to know about my engine assemblies that are public and available, and I want to know which ones were created within a certain date range. So you could say, always, like, show me, you know, that the date created of engines covers all time, which again kind of makes it like the filter is not really necessary if you're really just looking for everything. Or you could look at it for things that were created today, yesterday, this week, 7 days, and go all the way back. Or you can enter a custom date range and say, you know what, I'd like to see all engine assemblies that were created between 2015 and today. So that's a very basic set of filters. And I could just go ahead and run that now and get some information back. But before I do that, let's now talk about the fields to display. These are all fields from an inventory record. And this list is not final in that we're always adding to it. We're adding new sort of custom fields and calculations and things like that. But these are the things that after your filter is applied are going to be returned to you, the questions that are going to be returned to you. So for example, we would start with tag number because generally people are interested in looking at tag numbers when they're looking at inventory. We include vehicle stock number to see that to see what vehicles this inventory belongs to. Replacement cost, quantity, part manufacturer and model. These are all decent fields, but let's go ahead and add one more and just say, you know what, I'd like to see the date that it was actually created within this date range. And why don't you tell me how many days since it was created at all? So we've got those fields to display set, so let's go ahead and search. So this is what you get back from the transaction list. And let me pop back over to reports real quick. This is essentially, you know, a visual document. Yeah, it can be pulled into Excel, but like I said, there are calculated fields that mean that you can't always get everything out of here. Whereas the transaction list is basically just a CSV spreadsheet with the data that you specified on it. So one of the biggest strengths of the transaction list is you can stage the data that you want, and then you can export all that stuff to a CSV, an Excel spreadsheet, so you can work further with the data. That's probably the best part about the transaction list. Everything out of here exports cleanly to Excel. There's no mysteries about what goes into there. So as you can see here, we have all the information we've asked for. We can see the date that these engines were created, and they fit within the timeline filter that we set. And I'll mention this is demo data, so you know we don't have thousands and thousands of transactions in here. We just have a few of them here for demo purposes. So you can see here, it calculated the amount of days since this thing was put in inventory, tells you the date it was created, lists the assembly manufacturer model, how much quantity you have in the system, a replacement cost if you stated one, the tag number, and the vehicle stock number this thing belongs to. You may also drag and slide around any of these columns prior to exporting so you can kind of get them in the organization that you want. So probably put, you know, put replacement cost, quantity, and tag number all next together. So in a spreadsheet that looks all nice. So that's a very basic transaction list search. And then you can go ahead and save this search for further use to just instantly click it and pull it up again. So if I hit save search, kicks me over here to this quick search tab, and it just asks you to put in a name. So we're going to say engine sales with cost. And if I hit enter, it just automatically reruns it. So here under quick search, I've already built some saved searches already that I thought might be interesting for people to look at. So for example, and a common question that comes up that you can get through standard reporting is, what vehicles do I have available in the system and how many parts are left on them to sell? So if I go ahead and run this guy, I've now got that out here. So we have your vehicle make and model, the vehicle stock number, the year, the parts that are still on it, and the unallocated costs still remaining on that vehicle. And so again, this is a pretty basic report that you can work with to get some information out of it. But as you continue to use this, you're maybe going to start thinking of additional things that you want. Sort of like when you look at standard ITrack reports and you go, yeah, this is useful, but there's more information I need on it. Can you add columns X, Y, and Z? Well, in the transaction list, you can just do that rather than talking to us and asking us about it. So for example, you could say, how many days since this thing has been dismantled? And you can see that's a lot of days based on how old some of these vehicles are. You can also say things like, you know, I'd like to see the description that goes on this vehicle. I'd like to see the category this vehicle belongs to. I'd like to see the purchase date that this date was, or this vehicle was purchased on, and who we bought it from. And that all information, if it's there in the record itself, then gets populated. So as you go through and start, using the transaction list and seeing what it can do for you, you'll start thinking of new questions that you want to have it answer for you. And if there's something that you need to know that isn't in this list of fields, or something that's not here to be filtered by, you can go ahead and talk to us. And my turnaround time on getting those things put in is generally a little faster than reports, depending on how busy I am. The same thing is true of other sources like work orders. You can do work order reporting, which I know some of our customers have started using the transaction list to kind of get a sense of their production and what it's costing them, how long things to take to produce, so that they can refine their process, find inefficiencies, things like that. Another really nice feature of the transaction list is what's called the totals tab here. So on the totals tab, you can summarize the information that is coming from your results to kind of create a pivot table. So let's see, I'm actually going to run a different one here. Let's go ahead and run a invoice report. So you can see here, this has the description of every sales order that has been closed, that was closed sometime within the last 300 or 600 days, and is an invoice or document type of invoice. So if I go ahead and run this, these are all the sales orders according to the filters I set up. And then over here under totals, I can start summarizing this stuff. So let's go ahead and summarize subtotal. And let's see here. So you can see here, I chose to summarize subtotal, and I wanted to group it by customer company name. So in a way, the transaction list can save you a little bit of the effort you might do in Excel, because if you were to dump this all into Excel, you would sum up the subtotal column, and then you have to do other things in Excel to break out what belongs to Mega Truck, what belongs to Texas Truck, and what belongs to Tony's Trucks. Here in the summarize field, though, that's done for you if you set up the fields correctly. So you can see here that for the date ranges that we looked, Mega Truck had 14,500 in total sales, Texas Truck had 3,000, and Tony's Trucks had 3,300. So as you start playing with transaction lists, you'll start thinking of a whole bunch of different ways this can work. So for example, let's say you guys do commission at your yard, and you want to create a commission report to look at people's sales over a given date range to figure out what their commission total is. So I created this save search here, which is a sales order that is closed, where the counter person is Mark, and the document type is invoice, and it's never been voided, because you don't want to include voided sales in someone's commission report. So if I double click that, it's taking a little longer to come back than I thought. Oops. So you'll see here, Mark's run a lot of sales, and this is basically for all time, but this is 2 years worth of sales data. So if we come over here and summarize this information, you can see that Mark has done $59,360 worth of sales in the last 2 years. From that, you could build a commission report and get an idea of what commission he's doing. We narrowed that down just to Mark. If I were to take counter person off as a filter and just rerun the search, we would now get all salespeople. And I can come back here and say, hey, let's go ahead and summarize by counter person. And so you can see here, this is the list of all your salespeople, all the amounts total that have been sold over the last 2 years. And from this, you can build a commission report. So it's kind of hard to get an idea necessarily of what you guys need, because the transaction list is really driven by your ideas, your needs, your data questions. And it's there to empower you to kind of build those, build answers to those questions, and then put them in you can get them out of ITrack and get them somewhere else into a spreadsheet or something like that. So you can work with that data and get a better idea of what's going on. And I did miss something here that I should have started off with. If you guys want to chat to each other, make sure on the chat window you hit all attendees, not just all panelists and attendees. And secondly, if you guys have unsubscribed from any of our marketing emails, you're not going to be able to get some of the follow-up from this webinar. And you won't see any future things from us. So if you're interested in doing more of this or getting some feedback, giving feedback, make sure that you stay subscribed to our emails. And lastly, once I'm done talking, there will be a Q&A session. If you have questions in the chat window, I believe, if you I'm sorry, at the header at the top of the screen, if you click Q&A, that's where you should put your questions so they can be moderated and someone can put them in front of me after I'm done talking and we can go through them. So there are a couple things the transaction list can do, but require some, how do I put this? Some care in how you decide to structure things. So for example, I've been showing you how a single source works, but you can actually queue up multiple sources at the same time. And if you do that, you get a consolidated list of all the filters and all the fields to display that exist between the sources. However, there is a slight weakness in that the way the transaction list displays data, you will have mismatched columns if you ask for things from different sources that are not shared between sources. So for example, let me go ahead and sort all this. Let's just do, customer company name and a document type invoice, but then let's also put, sorry, having to think here. Yeah, this will probably come out okay. Let's go ahead and do adjustment name and adjustment amount. So as you can see here, you've got a lot of blank rows in here. And if you look here at the source, you'll see that we have inventory, and then as we go down, we have sales order. And you'll notice that for inventory, there is no customer company, whereas there are for sales orders. So you can mix and match sources, but you will end up with blank data in some columns. So they may not line up 100%. So generally, we think the transaction list works best when you focus on a single source, or if you're going to grab multiple sources, that the things in each source agree with each other, so you have data across all the columns. Because if you were to export this to Excel, it would look very funky, and you would end up having to clean out some of the stuff from your Excel spreadsheet after export because these are dead and blank columns. So while it can do that, you have to do a little bit of thinking, especially if you want to export that to Excel and Word, which fields you ask for. Just a couple other features here. You can sort the list of filter or fields to display, which depending on how many you've got can be pretty helpful, especially if you don't really know what you're looking for and just need to go through it one by one to get an idea of what you do have. Filters should be sortable. I think that's coming in one of the next versions of Enterprise that is yet to be released. You can also hide filters by right-clicking on anything and saying, you know what, I'm never going to look at this. I really want this out of my list of things so I have fewer things to see. And you can say, let's just go ahead and hide that selected filter. And if you decide that actually, hey, I do really need that, you can just go ahead and say, I'm going to unhide this filter for all time. Or you could display hidden filters temporarily, and the next time you close the screen and reopen it, it'll be hidden again until you say show it. But I will unhide that because I use that all the time. Same story over here. You can hide fields to display as well. And you can also, in the results set, like I said, reorganize columns. You can shrink, readjust them. I believe you can right-click and hide columns as well, which I really recommend rather than like squeezing it down until you can't see it, because then you'll pretty much never find it again unless you go around and slide out all the columns. So you can right-click these guys. You can hide those columns. You can come back. You can show them again. Like we've hidden more than that at some point. And then, like I said, you can save your search, and let's go ahead and demonstrate. You can also update your search. As I said, as you use it more and more things occur to you, you'll be like, you know what, in that commission report, I'd really like to know who they sold to, because maybe they're selling to some of our good customers, maybe they're selling to some of our bad customers. It's just information that's useful and necessary when you're trying to figure out commission. So we've added that field to our saved search, but now I'd like to go ahead and say, you know what, I really like that. I think I'm going to use that for all time. You highlight your saved search, you come down here and you say replace selected. And after that is done, you'll notice that if you changed any of the filters, the description of this will change. And once you've replaced it, you just hit apply. And now your saved search has been updated with the new stuff that you've put in there. You can come in here and you can change the description of things too. You can come in here and rename what it is. It'll tell you who it was created by, when it was created, and then you can also dictate who it gets shared with. For example, it can only be seen by the person that created it. It can be seen by anyone that's logged into my store, or it can be seen by anyone that logs into ITrack and has access to the transaction list. So it's a pretty powerful reporting tool that's always constantly growing and kind of evolving, mostly based on the requests that you guys put in. I would say I've probably added probably 10 filters and probably easily 30 fields in the last couple of years, just based on feedback from you guys. Occasionally I'm like, you know what, this is a good idea. I think everybody should have this. But by and large, additions to the transaction list are driven by you guys. To circle back around to filters, this is probably the thing that trips most people up most often, because when you have too many filters or your filters are configured incorrectly, you won't always see the data that you're expecting to do. So there's a couple different things going on here. There's a couple different kinds of filters. For example, on sales orders, the closed filter is basically a true false. And you'll know that because it's got a little checkbox here under the value column. Checked is true, unchecked is false. But then we have other kinds of filters that are dynamic dropdowns that actually pull data from the system. So Counterperson is pulling from a list of all employees in the software to give you an idea who you're pulling from. And then same story with document type. Document type is a list of documents pulled from the system. And then other ones are more considered ranges. So a sales order balance range, and let me find something to demonstrate this. Yeah, let's just do 200 to 500. So this is a range value in a filter. And you can see here you've got the value column and the value to column. So let's go ahead and search that real quick. So this only returned, oh, that's subtotal, not the invoice balance. So let me actually show the invoice balance along with this. So you can see there, this is the balance on the sales orders that were returned. And my filter said, hey, only show me invoice balances between $200 and $500 as an example of a range value. Dates are also considered ranges. But they're specific date range. And so you have a few more options there. You can, pick one of these and just have it automatically do the date math for you. Or like I said, you can do a custom, or you could do a date range based on however you want to do that. And then there are some that are just free type. So for example, if you were wanting to filter by internal comments, you would put something in here like resale. And anything that had internal comments with the words resale in it would get returned by the transaction list. So there's various kind of filters. It's a good idea to not overload your search with filters unless it's relevant to the specific question you need to ask. For example, show me all sales written by Mark within the last week where sales orders have not been closed yet, and I'm trying to think of one other thing to throw in there to make it complicated. And it's using the tax item of exempt. So you're trying to get an idea, how many sales has a counterperson in the last week written for people that are tax exempt? That's an example of something where you're going to use like 5 or 6 filters to try and answer your question, and then use any amount of display fields to get the data out of it that you need. But typically when I work with a transaction list and with people, it's almost always the filters that trip them up. So those are the ones that you got to be most careful with. I would start with fewer filters and then go to graduate to more granular filters as you get a better idea of what you're looking for, what you need to exclude, and what you need to include.